Welcome. I think everybody here knows me. I'm Amy. I'm in the department. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jessica Hellmann. She is the Russell M. and Elizabeth M. Bennett Chair in Excellence. That sounds amazing. I know. Really?
No, they took
Oh my God! She is not excellent anymore.
No, I know.
Now you're just a professor?
No, I'm a McKnight Distinguished University Professor.
Oh, she's a McKnight Distinguished University Professor.
It's all bullshit. Sorry.
In the Department of Ecology and Evolution and Behavior, and she's also the director of the Institute on the Environment at the University of Minnesota. She is the director of the Midwest Climate Adaptation Center, which I think she'll talk a little bit about today. I'm going to give you a little bit of a rundown because we go way back and you need the context. So prior to Minnesota, she was a professor at Notre Dame, she was a postdoc in British Columbia, and she was a PhD student at Stanford University. This will become important. But she was also an undergraduate at the University of Michigan, and she graduated from SNRE. But the most impressive part about her entire history as an academic is that she is an alumnus of the University of Michigan Biological Station. I mean, right?
Yeah.
Clearly.
No, it's formative.
Yeah, formative.
For sure.
Yeah. I mean,
literally.
Absolutely. She's leading the national and international conversation on adaptation to climate change. For example, she's been a leader in discussing assisted migration as climate adaptation happens around the world. She's a fellow of the Ecological Society of America and the AAAS. In addition to being a leading ecologist and conservation biologist, she sits on numerous boards, writes tons and tons of popular articles, works on state and national governments on natural resource management, and is a fantastic teacher and mentor. So I could spend, this is true, I could spend like the next hour like going on about all this amazing things that she does and her work. But part of the reason I know that not only is she a great scientist, she's a great mentor, is that Jessica is who started my kind of science career. So I worked with Jessica when she was a PhD student, counting these miserable little caterpillars, these miserable little endangered checker spot butterfly caterpillars. And it was like a terrible job, but but she taught me so much about experimental design and thinking about how you handle data and what science really looks like on the ground for people doing it. And I learned so much working with her. It was amazing. I mean, she just really gave me the passion for science. And so I really do think that one of the big reasons I'm an ecologist today is that I had the fortune of working with Jessica when she was a grad student. So she's had a huge impact on my professional life. She also introduced me to Nate on a blind date. So not only do I owe her my professional well-being, I also owe her my personal well-being. So anyway, I'm such a pleasure to have you here. I'm so pleased that you're going to give a talk to us today. And with that, I will let you take it away.
I feel like I should just sit down now. Call that done. Well, you guys, it is a privilege to be here. It is a privilege to be here for all the reasons that Amy just listed. It is personally important to me to be here, to be with Amy and with Nate and with all of you who are part of their scholarly community. It is, this institution is very important to me. I work at another institution that's doing similar kinds of things. I believe very strongly in what we're doing in these kinds of universities. So it just warms my heart to be with all of you, and I'm grateful that you would take time to come hear what I have to say. I'll share with you a tiny little story, because actually you were just saying, you said she's a fantastic mentor, and I thought, how the hell do you know? But no, I guess I just received the other day an email telling me that I was nominated for this like outstanding postdoctoral mentorship award. So I went to my postdocs. I was like, you guys, I was nominated for this postdoc mentoring award. And they were like, really? I said, well, that didn't come from you? No, not from us. So we'll see what happens there. Okay, so you can blame this on Amy because she told me I was allowed to do this. I'm going to give you a departmental seminar because that's where we are. We're all in the same place. We're all on the same page. But I'm not going to give you what I think is kind of the standard research talk, because I don't want to. I want to try to do something a little bit different. Of course, you're going to see research, you're going to see some results, but I'm going to weave this through an argument. This is kind of like an extended opinion piece about science, and I'm going to try to persuade you that an aspect related to ecology and evolutionary biology called climate change adaptation is worthy of your interest and your attention. I'm going to guess that you have some idea of what climate change adaptation is, but I would like to scope out what I think are some enormous and often interdisciplinary questions that need to be addressed, and try to appeal to you that you might think about the work that you're doing and how it interfaces with some of these large unanswered questions. So along the way, I will show you some work that we have done, actually over kind of, you're going to see some stuff that's kind of old at this point. Some work that we've done that I think speaks to some of these big gaps as illustrative examples of how we might go about pursuing some research to fill these knowledge gaps. But my dream would be that you would leave this talk thinking, maybe I should be thinking about that stuff, and I might actually have some science that could contribute to it, and I'd like to expand and grow that work. That's my goal. So that in doing that, we'll talk about like what are the big issues, what are the big opportunities, and I think some game changers. Like when we think about climate adaptation, it's going to force us to think about ecology and evolutionary biology, and especially conservation biology, in entirely new ways, which is cool, I think. All right. So I want to tell you a little bit, which Amy also alluded to. Amy. Amy. I was just telling her she calls me she calls me Jess, which I generally, other people don't call me Jess, and I know other people don't call her Aim, but there you go. Okay. In her intro, she talked a little bit about my background. I do want to share with you two things that I'm involved in leading, and I share them because oftentimes when you're in these seminars, you do talk about sort of professional development and who are you and how did you get to what you do, but also because these things that I'm involved in have a huge influence on how I see the world. I am not a real ecologist in some respects. My home department is ecology, evolution, and behavior. I'm a card-carrying ecologist. I'm a member of the professional society. But these things that I'm involved in influence my thinking a lot. The first one is something called the Institute on the Environment. I serve as the executive director. This is a large interdisciplinary institute. You could kind of think of it like a think tank. It is, our tagline is about building a future where people and planet prosper together. We cover all things sustainability. We do that by focusing on leadership development, on interdisciplinary research that moves the needle on sustainability, very outcome-oriented, and we talk a lot about storytelling. What is it the world needs to know about new ideas and about the people who are advancing them that would help change the world? So this is what I wake up most days thinking about. How do we use an interdisciplinary institute in higher education to drive sustainability outcomes? As an individual investigator, or in my own kind of topical slice of life, I also serve as the primary investigator for the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. The CASC, as we call it. You are part of the Midwest region also. There are 9 regional centers. This is overseen by the U.S. Geological Survey. Our responsibility is to provide science related to fish, wildlife, and natural resources for federal, state, tribal, and local natural resource organizations. And the purpose is to advance, let's see here, advance climate adaptation science, which is an entirely new notion itself. What does it mean to do climate adaptation science? And we do that science across all of the phases of what we call the adaptation cycle. Which is illustrated here from understanding climate impacts and climate vulnerabilities, articulating solutions to reduce those vulnerabilities, implementing them and testing them and implementing them, going back and evaluating their effectiveness, and cycling through this process over and over and over again. All of that is what constitutes adaptation science. In the center, we do that work in a way that is specific to our region, while also building capacity to pursue adaptation in this region. That means we support more than 40 research projects. We work with nearly 100 partners. We support and train more than 40 early career researchers. And we are pursuing 6 collaborative synthesis research projects with 8 organizations across our region. So this is a very mission-oriented, this is science in service to application. So these 2 mission-oriented organizations very much strongly influence my thinking and the way that I do my science now. And it helps me see all of the ways that we can put ecology to work. And so I would like to try to convey to you that that kind of mission orientation and putting our basic science into the mix with applied questions is an interesting thing to do. And let's talk about that with respect to climate change adaptation. I have alluded to this term already. I told you about a center that is dedicated to it, so what the hell is it? Let's define it for a moment. Climate change adaptation refers to the actions that people will take with the goal of reducing negative impacts of climate change, and maybe also a little bit of taking advantage of opportunities that might arise under climate change. Now, for a long time, I was very upset about this terminology, adaptation, because like all of you, I'm also consider myself a little bit of an evolutionary biologist. I had been working on the role of adaptation in tolerance to climatic change, like biological adaptation. Here we are using the notion of adaptation as defined by the climate science community and the climate policy community, which is about humans adapting and adjusting to climate change. And we're going to do that in the natural resource sector. Sometimes we might actually use natural selection and evolution as a tool for adaptation, but we're going to have to keep this duality of terminology for my purposes today. Climate change adaptation is fundamentally an interdisciplinary science because it is about people taking actions in response to a change in the environment. I'm going to talk about its application to natural resources. That's where I think ecology is most relevant. And we pursue it for nature, but we also pursue it oftentimes for people. So we're going to come back and talk a little bit about how people get to decide what is happening in adaptation, which is a little bit different than how ecologists and conservation biologists have thought about natural resource management historically. So here's what it's not. Maybe I don't need to convince you guys of this, but when we go around and talk about climate change, everyone assumes that solar panels and electric cars and greenhouse gas policies, it's related to all those things, but it is not about stopping climate change. It's about living with climate change. Whether it obviously interacts with these mitigation efforts, the greenhouse gas reduction efforts, because how much we have to adapt is a function, or is determined by how much the climate changes. So we get to decide if we're going to adapt to a low emission environment with relatively lesser amounts of climate change, or if we're going to be forced to adapt to a higher emission environment with relatively more climate change. And of course, in some cases, it may not be feasible to adapt to a high emission scenario at all. So it's important that we really be striving toward that lower emission scenario so we have the possibility of successful adaptation. But in the end, we will adapt to whatever world we are confronted with respect to climate. And of course, for a long time, we talked about adaptation as something we would need to do in the future. If and when we don't get our act together on greenhouse gas emission reduction, we know that's not the case now. It's not a future challenge. Climate change is here today. That means the consumption of climate adaptation science is right now, and the need for the science is immediate. So just to demonstrate that, I show this figure of average temperature already increasing more than a degree, and in red you can see how much global temperature has become consistently warmer than average in the recent past, with a marked shift occurring around 1980. And basically month after month, every month is hotter than the month before, every year is warmer than the year before. It's always hotter than what came, more or less hotter than what came previously. This is not a future problem, this is a today problem. We also, of course, experience climate extremes in the form of extreme heat, flooding, and wildfire seasons. So that means as we do adaptation science, we need to not just think about shifts in the mean, we have to think a lot about shifts in the variance. If you open the newspaper and you want to read about climate change, you will find quite a lot of content. Sometimes we're talking about the effects of climate change. You'll read a lot about mitigation and strategies for mitigation. And there are a lot of challenges that need to be addressed. And we hear about them on a regular basis, the challenges we must confront in stopping climate change, like cost, technology that is yet to be invented or implemented, shortages of materials for this renewable energy economy, lack of incentives and necessary policies to confront climate change. That's great, that's super. And it's lovely to open the paper and see conversation about where's copper gonna come from, or is the US government meeting its emissions reductions goals? But you hear a lot less about the challenges of adaptation. And there are just as many of them. And I would argue that overcoming many of these challenges does fall with, especially in the natural resource space, obviously, it falls to ecologists and biodiversity scientists. So this slide lists a bunch of challenges. This is not an exhaustive accounting. This is Jessica sitting down and writing down what she thinks are some challenges. Of course, we lack information on vulnerabilities to climate change. We lack information about tactics we might use in adaptation and the efficacy of those tactics. We lack information about the inevitable side effects of all the adaptation actions we might take. Worse yet, we don't have very much information about when we might screw those things up, which we would call maladaptation. Our toolbox of possible tactics is still quite small. We have terminology and conceptual frameworks in ecology that aren't up to the task of adaptation, like concepts like native and non-native. And adaptation is still seen as a technical field, when in fact it's wildly interdisciplinary, and it demands ecologists need to be working directly with the public, and we need to be thinking about things like law and policy and human psychology and ethics. So here's what I want to do. I want to walk through a few of these and unpack them a little bit. I want to talk about a few of these challenges. So I'm going to keep coming back to this Jessica's laundry list slide. Let's start with exploring a few particular adaptation strategies. We lack information about tactics and the efficacy of specific interventions. I want to draw an extended example of one adaptation strategy that we call managed relocation, or you might have heard of as assisted migration, and talk about how we might gain information about a particular tactic and its efficacy through this sort of extended example. So managed relocation is the intentional movement of species or traits. You could also do managed relocation of genes from areas of historical occupancy to areas that you expect to be occupied in the future given climate change. So this notion of managed relocation is depicted in this cartoon. This is a pretty dated cartoon. This is one of the very first that was published in the newspaper. It was created by the Boston Globe. And I love it because this little friendly guy, the idea here is an endemic rodent that lives on the peninsula of the San Francisco Bay. And its ability to just move further to the north, of course, is limited by its ability to get over the body of water that is the San Francisco Bay. So that's easy. You just need a guy who will carry you over the Golden Gate Bridge. So this friendly fellow is helping to move this endemic rodent across a dispersal barrier so that it could have the possibility of expanding northward. And he's pretty happy about it, but what I think is so brilliant about you picking this rodent is, as a reader, we're not so sure how we feel about this creature. So it conveys this kind of mixed emotions, good intent, but uncertain consequences. So just like every form of climate change adaptation, managed relocations has its pros and its cons. You would do it if you like something in the pro list that you're trying to achieve, and you can mitigate or reduce something in the con list. So with the upsides outweigh the downsides, you might actually pursue this tactic. So that's a key question. Under what circumstances what are the upsides, and when do they materialize, and what are the downsides? So, for example, managed relocation you might pursue because you're trying to prevent something from going extinct, or preserve some aspect of its genetic diversity, or you might be seeking to preserve some sort of ecosystem function or ecosystem service, or deliver it to a new area where it's needed. Of course, you might waste some money, you might create a pest. That's a major concern that has been expressed. Where you put this thing could have an impact in its introduced area. You might undermine your conservation efforts back in its source population. Or my personal favorite, what you're doing isn't good enough for some particular conservation application. So you would go about evaluating these different pros and cons. So I want to tell you about a little creature. When might we pursue managed relocation? I want to think about it for this guy. Some of you, if you're a lepidopterist or a lepidopteran lover, you might know this butterfly. This is the Karner blue butterfly. It's an endangered species. I've worked a fair amount on this creature. And a number of years ago, we did some statistical niche modeling that mapped occupancy. So this is historic occupancy for the Karner blue. It doesn't live in many of these places anymore, but this is where it occurred historically. And if you know about climate envelope modeling or niche modeling, what you do is you take the occupancy points, you essentially statistically correlate them to climatic variables, and then you take those variables and you project them forward with a climate model, and you say, where are the conditions associated with historic occupancy likely to occur in the future, to try to predict future occupancy. And I'm going to do that with these little green blobs. So this is where you would predict that the Karner blue could live in 2030, moving northward. A few decades later, those conditions are moving further northward still, in the 2050s, and by the 2080s, toward the end of this century, the distance between the green and the black is 500 kilometers. This is a teeny tiny little butterfly, and it is not going to fly that far. It's very, very far for a little, fairly sedentary butterfly to go. And so we look at this gap between the green blobs and the black dots, and we say, oh, the Karner blue is going to need some help. Maybe we could put it where it needs to go. So the first question we might ask is, if we were wanting to do this, we wanted to move the Karner, where specifically would we want to put it? That would be part of this efficacy or implementation. Well, it turns out you might start with a little more detailed exploration. In that same modeling projection paper, we discovered that the Karner blue does not occupy just one climatic niche. Using some principal components analysis, what you actually find is there are two distinct climates that the Karner blue occupies. One sort of general Great Lakes, which I call here the western form, and a New England form, which we would consider an eastern form. And if you take the distinctiveness of these two climates and run your model, again, niche model separately, you will generate different projections. So this is slide shows the green blobs were the green blobs I showed you already. This is what happens on the left-hand side when you model this butterfly's distribution as a whole. I showed you those green blobs over 3 time horizons. On the right-hand side is when you model the western and eastern forms separately at 2030, 2050, and 2080. And I want to point you to a few things. So for example, middle of the century, the whole species model would suggest some occupancy here in Ontario and Quebec. But if the Karner blue actually occupies 2 distinct climatic niches, you would not predict that region is an area of future occupancy. Or toward the end of the century, if you think of the species as a whole, you would not predict that it would occur in the Appalachian Mountains. But if this eastern form is really a thing, it might be able to exist there. So these kinds of exploratory models allow us to examine different future occupancy. And it suggests that we need to be thinking and looking more carefully about whether these distinct climates actually are important to the Kerner blue, and do more basic biology and ecology to explore this future occupancy question before we could begin to pursue managed relocation for this creature. So that niche modeling I showed you for the Kerner blue and the possibility of doing exploratory modeling helps us to unpack a potential tactic about moving something to a new location and ask questions about efficacy. And you can do that for any adaptation tactic that you might imagine. And we would need to do that for all adaptation actions we consider. Okay, so I'd like to pick another challenge on my list. I'd like to talk about side effects. Every adaptation action that we would pursue, because by definition it is a human intervention, it will have side effects. Even the most conservative tactic that you can possibly consider, it will have unintended consequences. And we will have some culpability for them because we decided to do that. So if we go back and think about managed relocation, it has some side effects that we could study. Again, extended example here. The most popular among the side effects of managed relocation is the idea that we would create new pests. Runaway invasives, if you will. Oops, we introduced them and they took off like crazy, and now we've got a problem on our hands. There are a bunch of ways that you could possibly study side effects, and a long time ago now, in one of the original attempts to do a side effect analysis for managed relocation, a student of mine and I looked at existing invasive species records. We built a database of invasive species in North America in order to do a kind of risk analysis. And in that, it was actually a US database, we looked at the continental origin of these invasive species across many taxonomic groups. And what I'm showing you here are the percent of invasive species, or percent of species that are designated, no, the percent of invasive species that come from within North America versus outside of North America. And this would be kind of a surrogate for this notion of managed relocation. The managed relocation would be about changing species ranges, not bringing them from far away places. That's not an analog for managed relocation, but shifting them within North America is a managed relocation analog. So how risky is that? What you see here is by percentage, it's not a very high percentage. 14% of invasive species in this database come from within North America. So you might say, that's not a lot. Most of them come from far away. We looked at different severity levels of the invasive. What you'll see is actually the percentage of intracontinental invasives is actually pretty comparable across those severity levels. So that 14% might be low, but you're just as likely to get a bad invasive as a more limited one. We also unpacked these data by taxonomic group. And what we found is that there are some species groups that have a quite high percentage of intracontinental invasives, notably ones in fresh water. So that suggests that there might be some systems where managed relocation actually confers a quite high risk of creating a harmful pest. And so we might not want to pursue it in those cases. This is a way of thinking about the relative cons and how they be materialized in different settings. We can also think about side effects by thinking about what would happen for individual species. So let's come back to this Kerner blue. A couple of years ago now, a group of us conducted a risk analysis for a batch of species. We did this originally for the National Park Service. They said we would like a framework for evaluating risks of managed relocation And then we'd like that framework populated for some candidate species. So we did this for the Karner blue. So we were exploring the risk of introducing the Karner blue into new areas. You cannot read the words on this table. That's okay. What I want to show you about this table is the color scheme. So the table is a survey of different risks in our framework for managed relocation of the Karner blue. Basically, the rows are different consequences, and the columns are different ways of sort of conceiving of those consequences. The purple color is a measure of how confident we were, but I want you to look at the red, yellow, and orange. That tells you how worried we were, how high or low that risk might be. And for the Karner blue, we were able, by going through this exercise, to hone into what did we think were the specific features that represented a higher risk. So the green stuff we felt like was either low risk. The yellow stuff we actually felt like we could moderate through management. But this orange stuff, we said, oh, this orange stuff is where we'd really want to concentrate the implementation and ask ourselves if we could tolerate that particular risk. What that says in that orange box of moderate risk for the Karner blue managed relocation is actually an indirect effect. It has to do with the host plant of the Karner blue, which is a lupin, and it's a nitrogen fixing plant. And if you were introducing that plant for the benefit of the Karner blue, it's the plant that could have the greatest consequences on the target introduced region, and particularly that it could compete with other endangered plants in areas where you might consider introducing the Karner blue. And by fixing nitrogen, also alter ecosystem conditions. So what we argued is that a framework like this could help you navigate down into the particular ecological circumstances that presented a risk that you need to evaluate and think about whether or not you could manage, and sort of move out of sight some of the lower risk scenarios. So those are the kinds of methods, the kinds of information that we might use to explore side effects and help us understand which of those side effects are small and which are large, and how we might go about mitigating those risks. So let's keep going. Let's talk about maladaptation. Some of the side effects could be large and surprising, something we would call maladaptation. There's maybe a fine line between what is a side effect and what is a problem. So for example, when you take medication for a particular treatment, a side effect would be something that's kind of annoying, but something that like makes you sick, a big side effect would say, maybe we shouldn't be taking this drug because the side effects are profound. We would call that maladaptation. Maladaptation also has this character of like, oh shoot, about it. We thought we were doing something good, but we actually did something bad. So we need to particularly pay attention to this concept of maladaptation and where it might show up. It refers to those actions that actually caused increased risk of negative outcomes. And that can include a whole suite of things, like actually increasing greenhouse gas emissions. So it has a positive feedback to climate change as a cause. It could increase vulnerabilities of some, either our target or non-target, or any other increased harm now or in the future. So this is something we need to be constantly on the lookout for. And while this concept is very well understood in the climate literature, hardly anyone has attempted to measure it, to identify where it might lie, and least of all, talk about it. So we are currently, this is a paper that will be out shortly. We've been, some postdocs and I have been going around talking with adaptation professionals about the notion of maladaptation. How do they feel about it? How do they mitigate, how do they prevent its occurrence? What is the discourse about maladaptation in the natural resource profession? And what we have found is do not talk about it. Do not talk about it, because if you do it, you might lose your job. In fact, the existence of it is preventing a lot of adaptation actions, and fear about it precludes a lot of intervention that might otherwise be helpful. So what we have been working on, this notion of developing what we call maladaptation dialogues. And I think a department, an entity like you all who are pursuing science, a willingness to engage in this unintended consequences dialogue could also be helpful. And that building this method of conversation about unintended consequences that is more than just talking and listening, it's about sharing of stories and building a common understanding without sort of shame or blame that can help deal with real world harms. A really interesting example is in the fire world, where there are prescribed burns or any kind of wildfire. The fire community will sit down and they'll do an after-action debrief. And they'll actually say, what went well, what went badly. And it's kind of off the record. And no one loses their job for saying, oh my gosh, we really screwed that up, we need to do that differently. It's a frank and honest dialogue about making steady improvements and admitting mistakes so they don't happen again. And we need to develop this capacity for maladaptation. Another thing we are working on in my research group is thinking about the parallels between evolutionary adaptation and climate adaptation, specifically around this notion of maladaptation. How natural selection is a sampling and experimentation protocol, if you will. It's a process of testing out different solutions and then has a kind of corrective action that leads to better outcomes, and how we might be able to mimic that process in adaptation decision making. So this slide is a, hey, please think about this, because we have a lot of work to do. I don't have any experimental results to offer on maladaptation. I just think it's worthy of our attention. So stay tuned on those. I'm hoping to have some publications shortly on both of those topics. All right, two more things on this list that I want to talk about. I want to talk about the relative lack of tools in the adaptation toolbox. We cannot pursue very effective adaptation if we don't have any tactics to deploy or strategies to do it. Some colleagues and I were the first to write a paper about managed relocation in 2007. It was an entirely new, and most people thought crazy, idea. But it was a real innovation. No one would or should, except for maybe biocontrol, go around putting things in new places and calling that a good idea. The only reason you would do that is because you had a conservation objective under climate change. There are very few other totally novel tools that we would consider for our management under climate change that are not essentially extensions of management tools we already have. Concern about this, the concern about the lack of outside-the-box ideas, was the motivation behind a report that a bunch of us wrote released last year. And this was our central motivating observation, that most adaptation efforts are still largely based on conventional approaches and designed to achieve incremental change. Why is that? And what are we going to do about that in our profession of conservation biologists, natural resource managers, and ecologists? What can we do to break out of conventional approaches and incremental change? Our goal was to promote creativity and innovation in the practice of climate adaptation. The notion of innovation is something we don't really talk about so much in our discipline. Many disciplines, innovation is their primary driver. And we wanted to promote creativity and innovation in the practice of adaptation, and we worked toward this goal by drawing on other fields where innovation is a way of pursuing inquiry. Like, there are entire disciplines studying the process of innovation and how do we stimulate innovation. And our goal was to take that body of literature and to bring it into our biodiversity space. And it turns out that innovation is a really, really hard thing to stimulate and very difficult to guarantee and to generate. And that is because of this well-known phenomenon called the Valley of Death. And this is a very well-established notion in innovation theory, if you will. And so basically you have a great idea and you publish about it, let's say in the scientific literature. We're often thinking about innovation as making stuff, but also we could think about making ideas in practice. So then you maybe take your good idea and you say, okay, well, how would we make this into something implementable? And maybe you have like a prototype or some experimental applications. And then you go into the Valley of Death, which is, it's very difficult to move from that prototype to some scale of actual implementation. And then ultimately to diffusion and adoption across the horizon. It seems like managed relocation is beginning to be implemented and might end up being diffused and adopted, which I'm not advocating for necessarily. But how do we get ideas all the way to application at scale? So we talk a fair amount about this Valley of Death. For example, we know from the innovation literature that institutional commitment, like university commercialization and technology transfer offices, are really important. Seed funding, venture capital, ways of investing at this particular prototyping stage is a tactic to get ideas through the Valley of Death. We also know that that transition from ideation to wide-scale deployment can be reinforced by things like incentives for prototyping. Don't just take your idea and publish it. What would be needed to take it to the next stage? And how can we reward individuals like this? It's the job of organizations like universities and the climate adaptation science centers to put strategies and tactics in place to overcome that Valley of Death. So I'll let you go look at our report. It talks about a bunch of things, like this theory and practice of innovation. I'm going to point you to some barriers to innovation and enabling conditions, but there's a lot more to say. There are case studies in here. I think departments, academic units that are interested in stimulating adaptation as related to, or innovation as related to adaptation, could actually use some of these things to think about policies and practices within your own department, in your own promotion processes, the way you celebrate success, that could be informed by this report, if you so choose. So what are some of the innovation barriers? And in our report, these are kind of tailored to the adaptation context. So there are institutional barriers. Think about natural resources as a sector. Oh my gosh, risk aversion. This is like when we wake up, we are terrified of doing something wrong or bad. Unsupportive institutional culture, lack of incentives for things like prototyping and implementation, restrictive regulations and policies. That's also the case in the natural resource space that makes us quite conservative. There are knowledge and learning barriers. So much science to be done that's needed to understand what implementation would look like. Resistance to new ideas. This happens in our discipline. We do have a resistance to new ideas. We're very enamored with our established theories. Lack of evidence for effectiveness, poor knowledge transfer. Poor knowledge transfer would be like the amount of communication that goes on between academics and practitioners. Social barriers, the fact that we operate in silos, the lack of diversity about perspectives of what it means to be implementing and why people care, power dynamics, conflicting values. Capacity barriers, I'm busy. Why am I prototyping when I could go back and develop my next paper? Limited financial investment, limited human capacity. Fortunately, there are some enabling conditions that can help overcome some of those barriers. One of them is having committed leaders who demonstrate that it is okay to be involved in innovation, including failure. Showing trust in that translation process. That means working closely with practitioners and managers to show that the ideas and the designs that are coming from academia can be put into practice and will be there for that process. Nimble and adaptive organizations, openness to risk, and being outcome focused. What is it that we're trying to achieve? And we'll make adjustments to our tactics and strategies to make progress toward our goals. See, now you probably wouldn't think that would normally be in a departmental seminar, in a research seminar. I think that as higher ed organizations and as departments, which is why I raise it in a departmental seminar, we have some control over these enabling conditions. And we can promote certain processes within our organizations to facilitate them. And yeah, take that for what you wish. It's not a guarantee that if you do these things, you're going to get innovation, but there's a large literature that suggests that these are key ingredients that if you put them into place, innovation will follow, and it might surprise you what it is. Okay, I want to turn to my last adaptation challenge I want to talk with you about. And that is the question, is adaptation, after I've argued that ecologists and conservation biologists and biodiversity scientists need to think about it, I'm going to ask whether it's even an ecological topic at all. And that is, and I want to make this point using a decision framework that we proposed for managed relocation way back in 2009. We argued in a paper that was published in PNAS, Dave Richardson was the lead author, that we could evaluate managed relocation along 4 dimensions. And I'm going to show you sort of 2 manifestations of this framework for a hypothetical case. But firstly, let me just show you what this figure means. So 4 dimensions. The need for intervention, which we called focal impact. The risk of side effects, which we called collateral impact. And these are sort of opposite to one another. The motivation for doing managed relocation and the possibility for harm. We actually do 1 minus the possibility of harm. So having a high score means not harm. So need to do it, not harmful. And then 2 other dimensions are about feasibility and acceptability. So feasibility might include things like money and policy, and acceptability would be a whole bunch of stuff that's not ecology. How do people feel about it? And here I'm showing 2 different evaluations on these 4 axes for a hypothetical case of an endangered butterfly, and I'm showing it for sort of 2 hypothetical stakeholder groups. A very conservation motivated, very concerned entity that says, yes, we would give high scores on these 4 dimensions. The colors are supposed to represent variation or uncertainty. And another skeptical group that would not score very high. And specifically, they could articulate exactly which dimensions they were on board with and which ones they had problems with. So in this hypothetical example, both of these communities agreed that if we wanted to do managed relocation for the endangered butterfly, it would probably work. So feasibility, they both gave high feasibility scores. But one of them doesn't find it very socially acceptable, nor necessarily justified in terms of its need. Why am I showing this to you? Well, we argued that these are the 4 dimensions that mattered, and we could sit down across difference and talk about these 4 dimensions and have effective conversations about our concerns, about our desires and our concerns. But I point them out here because there isn't a single right answer. It's not right that you would pursue managed relocation for this butterfly, or right that you wouldn't. And science is vital in adjudicating the decision about managed relocation, but it does not lead you to the answer. Because in these 4 dimensions, there's just as much content about values and policies and judgments and priorities. There's as much about people in here as there is about butterflies. And so when we pursue adaptation, we as ecologists have data to speak to each of these dimensions, but we are not dictating, we are not the technology experts that will tell you whether or not you should do this. There are social complexities at play, and we need to have the ability to engage in those social complexities. Okay, so we have something to say, but we don't get to call the shots. And we need to be sophisticated in our ability to interact with the human dimensions. All right, so this was my laundry list, my non-exhaustive laundry list of what Jessica thinks. Adaptation science is still in its early days, and we need really creative solutions to fill this emerging and important field. I think there's probably something on this list that many of you could contribute to. It might not become your wake up every day and think about it objective, but there may be ways to start to address some of the things on this list that you can participate in. I would love for you to challenge conventional thinking and to think about innovative ideas, because we need them in the adaptation space. And there are so many ways that ecology can make progress against this list of challenges and unknowns. In the Midwest, where we are, I think it would be great if we pursued these challenges in unanswered questions in the context of the specific climate issues we face. So I invite us back to the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, which has already defined with our natural resource partners what are the issues that they are seeking scientific information about. So we have a set of science priorities that fall in 5 domains: heavy precipitation events and drought, loss of winter, altered hydrologic regimes, novel terrestrial landscapes, and barriers to and opportunities for adaptation, which has a high degree of human dimensions associated with it. It could be technical barriers, it could be also policy and social barriers. So we can work on that list of challenges and unknowns, and we can do that in the context of specific issues that we face here in the Midwest. In fact, if that is compelling to you, the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center meets every summer, and I would love to see you there. This is a community of scholars. The University of Michigan is not an official former member of the Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is a whole other set of politics that we could talk about. But it is a community of scientists that you absolutely are invited to be part of, and there could be a lot of interesting opportunities there. One place to show up would be at our annual meeting, which is going to be at the University of Illinois this year in August. And I would invite you to this website. If you'd like to know more about how you could participate or engage, you can also just reach out to me directly too. It's a great community of people who are coming together to think about all the stuff I've talked about today.